So our project is to assess the impact of gender and culture on motivating virtuous selves, so motivation to behavior.
Okay, so we're going to start with a little story, and we're going to refer to this story as the math test experiment. So in this experiment, there were Asian American women at American universities solicited for a psychology experiment. And what they did when they came into the study was they took a survey. And the survey either asked them questions about being Asian, or it asked them questions about being a woman. Okay, so then they took a math test. Now, maybe everyone in here doesn't know this, but in America, there's a really strong stereotype that Asians are very good at math and women are not. Okay, so I guess expectedly, when they were primed with the Asian survey, they did really well on the test. And when they were primed as being women, they didn't do so well on the math test, but that was the only difference. Then they replicated the study in Canada, where there is no stereotype about Asians being good at math, and the results were not replicated. Okay, so this tells us that it gives us quantitative results for an implicit bias having to do with culture and this type of priming.
So what we want to know is if virtuous behavior can be motivated in the same way that there was a disincentive earlier by appealing to gender or culture. And what we know so far is that, as we all know, defining self is a little tricky, right? So there's no common definition of self, either across or within psychology and philosophy.
And we really wanted to avoid talking about personality psychology, because personality psychology has to do with things like how open you are, or how extroverted, or how neurotic you are, right? But we want to get to something much deeper than that.
And that's what we think the self does. So what we know, though, is that awareness is not enough to motivate behavior. So I'm a philosophy PhD student, but my day job is in research compliance, so I look at research ethics. And there's a fair amount of evidence that students do not behave better after an ethics course. Before and after, there's no difference. There's some evidence they do worse. There's some evidence that the courses are harmful. So what we want to do to test this is invite adults of various ethnicities and genders to participate in an online adventure. They'll be primed for either gender or culture. They will then make ethical decisions and maintain weekly journals.
Okay, so if you turn to page 2 of the little booklets that we gave you, oh, and if you don't have a booklet, Max has extras, so just gesture to Max and he'll hand you a booklet. Sorry, we tried to pass them out based on where people had left things at lunch, so we missed some spots, I'm sure. So it's on page 2 of the handout, and we have 3 research questions that we're going to go over. The first one is that when individuals identify with a certain aspect of themselves, just like the Asian women in the study that I mentioned, does this cause them to make more ethical or less ethical decisions? Our second research question is whether they would make different types of decisions in different types of scenarios. So for instance, you might be more ethical in maybe a business relationship where the stakes are much higher than in a social relationship, or vice versa, or maybe a civic situation. And there might be differences for whether you're identifying with your culture or your gender. And lastly, is whether different cultures would respond differently to ethical dilemmas. Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to be doing the study in Hawaii. It's not going to be on like Hawaiian culture necessarily. So there will be some people from Hawaiian and Polynesian cultures. And we will probably also do some of the testing on people around Samoa, maybe Guam, things like that. So that's important because of the demographics.
Because it does give us a demographically varied environment. So these are the differences between Hawaii and mainland when we look at the populations, right? So the most striking is white alone, much less. But the point we'd like to point out is look at the blue bars, right? That's Hawaii. It's very evenly distributed, or much more evenly distributed than the mainland. So the odds of us being able to get an ethnically diverse pool are pretty good. So we believe that we are addressing the questions that were asked by SMV 1, 2, 4, and 13, which have to do with diversity and innovation and cross-cultural comparisons. So what we want to do, we're using the appeal of gaming and technology to extend the research on priming from math to an ethical dimension. We believe that we'll look at the intersection of two components of self, gender and culture. We can remain ontologically agnostic about self and have self-pluralism and still prompt for behaviors, we believe. So we'll see. If that works, it will extend research on motivation to virtuous behavior that would apply in international and intercultural contexts.
Okay, so now for the deep integration and methodology. The first part of this is who we are. So that's us with Jonathan. Now, my background is mostly in computer-mediated communication, and I've studied that across cultures and intercultural communication, as well as a little bit of instructional design, both as a research scientist and also in the private sector. And most recently, I've been studying decision-making having to do with social media and politics.
So as I said, I'm a philosophy PhD student. I also have a background in law and communications. So I come from that perspective and a strong interest in research ethics. Jonathan is our research assistant. He has bachelor's degrees in both psychology and philosophy and experience in gaming. So he's been helpful to the team.
So that's how we are ready to do this. But part of the deep integration requirements were also that you're a little bit outside of your comfort zone and that we are all learning something from this experience. So for me, I've always been in multidisciplinary projects, and all of my publications that aren't single publications are interdisciplinary. But I only have one publication with a philosopher, and it was on how to teach an artificial neural network to play Cajun music, so very different from ethics.
And as you just heard, a lot of the ways that philosophers do experiments are thought experiments. So I'm very excited about the possibility of having actual data. Jonathan says he was always that guy who was either too theoretical or too practical, depending on which class he was in. So he's pretty excited to see how the disciplines can communicate with each other.
Okay, so the methodology. I think is this in the handout too? Mm-hmm. It should be on
yes,
the
4
handout.
and 5.
So
Pages 4 and 5.
4 and 5. Okay, so we're going to give a survey. It's going to be given via email, and we've got a little pilot of this, but hopefully that it will be mobile friendly too. So we'll email it to the subjects. I'm thinking probably about 25 people per group. We'll email them a survey, and after they take this priming survey for gender or culture, or the control condition, which has no survey, then they'll be led into this interactive graphic novel where they make choose your own adventure style ethical decisions. So that will be that email once a week for 3 weeks. And then on the side, they'll also do a weekly journal in the same platform. So it's within subjects too, so they'll all be in all the conditions. So this is just a graphic of that, graphic representation of what I just explained. They'll do the survey, and then they'll go through the interactive graphic novel. And of course, the platform will track their answers to everything. We're going to be looking at that. And then on the side, they'll do the weekly journal. Mm-hmm.
So we have described our project variously as an online adventure or a game, but we'd like to give you just a little sense of what it will look and feel like for the participants. So we have a little bit of a demo that's just kind of proof of concept. As Roxy said, probably everything will change but the font.
And if you have a computer and you'd like to go through it yourself as she explains it, the link is on the title page. So just keep in mind that we have not written the script yet. So the text will say the same font. Basically, everything else is going to change. So we just wanted to show that we can do this.
So what we're proposing is that there will be a choice of avatar, although it won't be binary. There'll be a lot more avatar choices, right? Then you can name yourself, name your avatar. The game remembers your name. We can show video, we can show graphics, we can make choices that are work-related, so we can give context. I'll pick a choice that's either gender or culturally sensitive. We can have a video that shows the result of that choice if we want. It can go on to the second round of scenarios. And again, we're presented with choices. It goes on to 3 different opportunities to make choices that are each somehow informed. One of them's picking a song, a playlist. One of them's picking a guest. One of them's picking a group to donate money to. We can have audio. So they're different. It's a multimedia appreciation, but the look and feel is like a graphic novel. Okay, and then at the end, we'll have a space for a little input there, and that's separate and apart from the weekly journals that will also be compiled.
Okay, so back to business. That
Page
was a little
6.
show. The first, these are on page 6. The first hypothesis is that we'll find effects for the culture and gender prime. That's why we're doing them. And the control won't necessarily show effects. They might be the least ethically sensitive. And we think that we'll probably, and we're not necessarily sure about this, whatever we find for the different scenarios. So they're doing this for over 3 weeks, and in each week it'll be a different type of scenario. We think that there might be more ethical decisions in the business scenario because you have so much HR training and the stakes are higher, like I said. And we also think that the different cultures will respond differently when they identify with their culture. Now, the data and analyses are also in the handout. They're in a table, but I'm going over them in 2 different slides. We'll have the survey data. We'll have the choices that they made in the adventure, because it's all going to be tracked. And we'll also have the weekly journal entries. For the survey data, we can use that because, I mean, it's a prime, but it's also all these really important questions, like how much do you identify with your gender? Like, do you think that you're like super feminine or a little masculine, things like that? So we'll have those, and we can compare those to how that they perform in the weekly journals and in the ethical questions. So the choices in the adventure, of course, we'll do an analysis of variance with those. And the journal entries, I have latent semantic analysis here, but we can do all kinds of lexical analyses depending on what they look like, right? We might want to do n-grams. We might just want to do latent semantic analysis. It just depends on what things end up looking like.
So the development is basically in 3 stages. First, we have to actually write the scripts, put it into the software, do the creation of the ethically sensitive scenarios. Then we do then we actually do the experiment, which will be over a summer, right? So they'll get the emails, do the journals, do the follow-up, and then finally we have the second year will be spent in analysis. And comparing it, looking at what the implications are for philosophy, psychology, and submitting it to journals. So in the timeline, this basically shows the first year, how long we think it'll take to do each of these challenges that we mentioned. Going to the summer session where we send it out. I forgot to mention we'll send it to IRB at the end of the first year, recruit during the first year also, and then the analysis and write-up in year 2.
Okay, so now for the challenges and our responses to them. The first challenge that we faced when we started this was the project itself is a challenge. In the call for proposals, it says that it's supposed to be really challenging and stressful, right? So we're combining psychology and philosophy, and we're going a little bit outside of our comfort zone. So it's not as easy as all of the other things that we've done in the past, right? So this is kind of an outline of all the steps of this study. And of course, each thing is not, the size of the boxes does not represent the amount of work that goes into them. I'm sure that all the philosophers in here know that application to field is a very big part of it. So we're not only doing our own parts because it's interdisciplinary, right? So we're not just doing, I'm not just doing my part, but I'm showing Cindy how my part goes. So that really amplifies the amount of work that would be.
And we've been describing the difference in view of self in philosophy. One of the ways that I think if we get these results that it pokes back at philosophy is in both intellectual and moral virtues is that an account of self would not be generic and it would be under-theorized if it didn't include some kind of story about gender, and that using those to motivate ethical behavior through business or research ethics would have to take into account gender and culture as well, and that might actually provide the motivation that's been missing.
So there's other challenges too. I'll just go over them kind of quickly. They're not as much maybe. Oh, but we did want to mention how we're dealing with that challenge, and look at it. We're here. We're still friends. So the first challenge was making the different scenarios parallel to each other, because you want for the different primes those experimental conditions to be as similar as possible, right? And so with the gender questions, there's 2 choices usually, right? It's male or female. And then with the cultural question, there's a number of them. So that's why we have, okay, we're out of time, so never mind.
That's also in the handout.
Our fun graphic picture of ourselves. And, well, we were going to tie it back in with the math experiments, but we won't. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Could you say more about how many choices they're going to have each week in the scenario? I'm just wondering how much data you're going to have to analyze there.
Okay, yeah, they'll have each week they'll have 3 different questions, and then there's also the journal entries, and then each question would have 3 choices, is what we're planning right now. But we haven't written the script yet, too, so that's kind of the idea.
That's sort of a low number. I'm a
Yeah.
little worried about the low power there. And then do you have any worries that they might get primed by how they answer the first question? That's going to influence how they answer the second one? Or are they going to be pretty independent things? It's unclear to me what you're asking exactly.
So it would be something like if you're given a choice of these different people, like you have these things, or one of the examples that Jonathan had thought of was if you are on a radio show, like for this radio scenario, which cause do you care for? So we had thought about doing it that way, but we might actually do where you can care, instead of you're not going to necessarily choose between gender, culture, and a control answer. What we're thinking is you would choose, and it would either be like care a lot, kind of not neutral answer, and then don't care at all. Does that answer the question?
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of decisions to make.
Well, no, I'm sure that we're going to do that. I'm just nervous. No, I'm sure about that. I'm not sure how many questions we'll have because we don't want them to be in it for too long. And so 3 might go really quickly, and then we could add more because I agree that is not that much data. So, I mean, with the math test, they had more than 3 math questions, right? Yeah. So, yeah. Okay.
Jennifer, Dan, and Will have questions now.
I'm just a little bit unclear. At some points, it seemed as though you were just interested in seeing whether priming for agenda versus priming for culture made a difference in the decisions that they made. But at some points, it sounded as though you were interested in seeing whether some responses were more ethical versus other responses. And if it's the latter, how are you going to decide what constitutes a more ethical response?
What we hope to do is create the scenarios that are ethical and that ask them to do something, right? So there's a behavioral response. We can draw on some of the assessments of ethical behavior that are now used in the research ethics and business ethics studies. So we can go from that. There is also priming questions that are out there in that general area that we can draw from. So the interest is really engaging what they would do in this scenario, what their choices would be, and it would be something that they would have to not just have an opinion about, but take some kind of an action. Does that answer your question?
And then you're going to decide whether what they do is more ethical or less ethical, or you're just going to see whether there are gender-related and culture-related differences?
The goal would be to see whether it's a more or less ethical decision after having been primed for gender or after having been primed for culture. Yeah.
It just seems like that's going to require a lot of thought about how you're going to measure that.
Yes.
We could do it.
This isn't the first version. This is as far as we've gotten so far.
So the idea is that maybe, like in Hawaii especially, there's a huge stigma against being white, like huge. So if we prime a white male, then if he's given a cultural, ethical question, I think that he would actually be very, very culturally sensitive. And we're going to say that that was the high ethical answer. Because of the stigma against white men in Hawaii, I think that they would respond, like overcompensate kind of, but it'd be interesting to find out.
Dan and Will?
Oh, my thanks. I was struck by your comment at the outset that your work here is deeper than the personality. I take it that by personality you meant the big 5 personality. So I wonder in what sense this is deeper, or what kind of virtuous self is it that you're after that does it have personality or dispositional or trait-like features at
Well,
all? What,
Okay.
go ahead.
I'm not saying necessarily that personality characteristics don't have to do with yourself. You know, they're definitely descriptors of yourself. But if I'm standing here and I haven't said anything to you, you don't know if I'm neurotic or if I'm extroverted or
Sure.
introverted, but you know that I'm a woman. You know, and so that not only influences how I act in the world, but it also influences how I'm treated in the world. So it's kind of a part of myself that I can't get away from. You know, and culture, a lot of cultures are like that. Not all of them. I'm also Cajun. You wouldn't know that. But most cultures also work like that. So I'm not saying that personality has nothing to do with the self. It definitely does. But we wanted to get to something that I don't like more. You can also change how extroverted you are. You definitely. It's a lot more work to change your gender or culture.
Will?
So I loved this, and I loved the game. And I could see the the expertise in human-computer interface in the design of the game. I got to play it here. So it made me wonder. It seems like a really potentially a method that could be used quite broadly, a huge number of research questions. And I'm wondering, are there other studies that have tried to gamify data collection?
You know, that's why I kind of wanted to not use the word game, because there's a real hostility to women in gaming that might be prime, right? So, but graphic novels, not so much. Comics, not so much, right? So it looks like a comic. It looks like you're reading a comic. It doesn't look like your avatar is going out and joining some military force, right? So we call it a game, but I kind of want to don't get into the whole Gamergate nonsense, and we want to keep it nice and friendly. It's a comic.
But to answer as far as psychology with games, I do have experience with the University of Memphis doing pedagogical games or an IES, Education Sciences grant. So,
Right.
and that involves decision making, which this is decision making. So,
I mean, this is existing software. This is Qualtrics, so we didn't have that.
this is Articulate,
Oh, that's Articulate.
which we didn't use at Memphis.
So is it the general question whether this particular method has been used to gather data on this issue?
Is there evidence that this kind of method can be effectively used to enhance data collection of various types that involve decisions? So I'm aware of some of the work on gamification in teaching. I'm not sure of gamification in research design.
Well, we used it for research in the pedagogical studies, but I think that, and I'm not aware of it being used in any ethics studies, so that's maybe novel. But I think the use of something like this in a way, it makes for more ethological validity, because if you're sitting down and some guy in a lab coat comes up to you and he tells you, okay, can you fill this out? We want to find out about yourself. What would you do in this ethical scenario? In this one, they're kind of more themselves. Hopefully they'll have it on their cell phone, so they're not brought into this sterile environment. They're still themselves, and it's fun and it's engaging, and we could make it 15 questions. They're having fun, they're playing this graphic novel. So it kind of gives us more freedom, I think.
And they're taking it from wherever they are. They're in their own environment.
I had a question, and that is, at one point you said that this, you hope this is going to extend research on motivation to virtuous behavior. Could you say a bit more about how you expect that to be done?
Well, like I said, we know what doesn't work in terms of research and business ethics education specifically. That's applied. And what I would want to suggest is that if we moved away from trying to just deliver information in a training environment, and so that would be like the intellectual virtues. Okay, so teaching is enough, but it has to be paired with the moral virtues of motivation. So we want them to take on and have them hold that. So it can be experiential in this sense. It could be a small group, interactive group. Some of those are more effective means of giving ethics education, and they're not being widely used. They're still all just suggestions, and people have different models are saying, well, this worked in my class. If we can collect some data that this kind of approach works, then that would support that move.
Okay, so then you've got a couple of aims of the project, a couple of different aims of the project.
Yes.
And one would be to collect data using the experience of people taking the game
Right.
about what their choices would be. And the other would be to collect data about the use of the game in ethics instruction to make people behave more ethically. Is that part of the issue? See if it's better, or compare it with classes in which this particular method isn't used, and see if there are any behavioral changes afterwards?
We want to do that, but also another thing we want to do is replicate this on the mainland if we have time, but we don't want to make promises we can't keep. So we do want to do that, but I don't know if it's within the scope. But we are working with the ethics training department at the University of Hawaii in a project where we're going to look at different types of ways to train people for ethics at the university. Because like Cindy said, different ways.
One possible future direction that's way outside the scope right now is that if priming for gender has the impact we think it does, then walking into a graduate philosophy seminar primes women in a way that men are not. And that might have some significance to some of the discussions in the profession about the drop-off between undergrads and grads. Outside the scope of the future direction.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, but thank you very much.